All right, folks. Super excited to share today's guest story with you all. I've got Timothy Moser from Learncraft Spanish, and I've been in Timothy's online language course for about 9 months now. And I was really attracted to his style of teaching. And he really explains things in a very, I guess, different way to traditional language learning. So, really excited to pick his brain on all things skills. Timothy, thanks for jumping on today, mate.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Great, mate. So let's start with a bit about yourself, like who you are, how you got into what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I kind of started online as just kind of covering more random learning topics, and I'm very interested in people's motivation. So my motivation for learning things really was just for the sake of doing it. So I had a productivity podcast back in the day, and then on the side, I started also a podcast about memorization and accelerated learning. And pretty quickly, what kind of occurred to me was that what people want to do for fun versus what people actually need to do and will pay for are kind of different things. And as things evolved, it kind of turned more into people asking to learn a language, especially Spanish. I hired coaches, and long story short, 10 years later, here we are with, coaches across the world, hundreds of coaching students, and it's a full business that kind of grew almost by accident, but based on like you were saying, kind of our principles of teaching things a little bit different from how other people teach, and focusing really on motivating our students and focusing on what it is that motivates them to learn a language.
Yeah, very cool, mate. Yeah, just before we jumped on, you said about the productivity. So, at what point along that journey did you say, okay, I'm going to actually just shift to become basically a language learning coach?
Well, I mean, that's largely a personal thing where I really thought that I could do everything I wanted to do at once. And I think, as you probably know, like that's just a recipe for burnout. So I was running the productivity podcast and the memory podcast and the Spanish podcast. I think there was a moment when I was trying to run all three at the same time. And the memory podcast and the language podcast were both daily shows. So at some point, it was just like, well, the productivity audience is less than 5% of my other audience. So if 1/3 of my time has to go somewhere, it just kind of the metrics work out in favor of dropping that other thing.
Gotcha. And then with Spanish, like, are you, native from birth, or like, tell us about your Spanish learning journey?
Really, it was kind of random. I only learned Spanish kind of as in the process of teaching accelerated learning techniques. So people kept asking about, like, how do you learn a language? And I'm like, well, I'm not an expert in that, but what I can do is I can hire contractors from Argentina and Spain and Mexico to help me develop a curriculum based on the accelerated learning principles that I know. And so what ended up happening was I I kind of learned Spanish alongside a lot of my audience. And then when it was clear that it was working really well, that's when it turned into, okay, we're going to start teaching this and turning it into a business.
That's so cool, mate. So like you were kind of as you go, kind of building it as you go. These are my lessons. This is, what I'm struggling with as an English speaker. This is how it's different. And then you started building that into like a curriculum. Is that the how things went?
Exactly. Yeah. And it turned into a curriculum, it turned into a coaching program, and it just, yeah, it kind of organically turned into a business.
Very cool.
Hey, my
Uh,
my lighting's doing a weird thing. I rarely have calls at this time, so I'm gonna have to close the curtain real
sure.
fast. Give
No
me 1 second.
problem. No problem. Great, mate. So I'd like to stay on the Spanish, and then I'd like to go into kind of broader skill learning and accelerated learning. So, like, for Spanish, what do you see as the biggest for English speakers? I think a lot of people, myself included, like they like the idea of learning a language, but a lot of it is like it's never going to happen. It's so hard. So, what are some of the roadblocks you see with native English speakers stopping them from learning a foreign language?
It's interesting because, like, after, again, like over 9 years of doing this, there's one factor that makes the biggest difference. Um, and it's just, what is your intrinsic motivation to learn Spanish? So we've worked with thousands of coaching students, and they have all kinds of different reasons to learn a language. And for many of them, like for me, it's like, man, this is a life goal that I really want to get under my belt. For some of them, for many of our students, actually, it's because of a family member, or they're, marrying into a Spanish-speaking family, or they live in a Spanish-speaking country, something like that, where it's so personal and such a daily part of their life that they can't get away from it. Those students tend to be very, very successful. And then students who don't tend to be successful are people who are learning it for professional reasons. So we've had hundreds of people come in and say, man, I'm going to have a better time in business if I learn another language. And this is super important to me. This is a huge deal. This could mean, breakthroughs for my career. About 2% of those students are successful. So it really is the intrinsic motivation. And then the intrinsic motivation in turn fuels just kind of the daily patterns of working on a language every day. Because very much like fitness, Spanish isn't something you can just kind of squeeze into your weekend or just decide to make it a kind of a side project you pick up and put down. It really is a lifestyle. And for Spanish to become a second language, to become something that you really have as a part of your identity, so that you think in Spanish, that just has to be a daily pattern. And in our experience, it's not really going to be a daily pattern unless that intrinsic motivation is there.
Yeah, you've made some really good points there. Like, so first of all, there's people going to be listening being like, well, my partner isn't Spanish, or, I don't have that big driving force. So, and maybe it's not a career thing as well. They just would really like to learn the language, but they don't have that, rock that you're saying is clearly a big metric for success. So what advice could you give to someone like that?
I would say make it, first of all, ask yourself the why question. Just ask yourself, how big of a deal is this? Is this going to make as big a difference as something else that I could be doing with the same amount of time every day? So we're talking about, spending 1 or 2 hours a day. If you're wanting to become fluent in a year, which is a timeline that we give a lot of our students, 1 or 2 hours a day is the amount of time that you could learn an instrument. It's the amount of time that you could, you could make some really great progress in like physical fitness, for example, and see the visible results very quickly. Whereas 1 or 2 hours a day for language learning, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle, and the results that you see it's just like kind of hard to see sometimes. And so if you are sure about that, if you're just sure about that objectively, then I think you can set yourself up for success by instituting daily patterns that just kind of happen automatically. Like, I don't know how much of productivity stuff you've covered on the podcast. I really like Atomic Habits because it has a lot of little tactics that you can put in place just to try to make these habits more automatic. And this is something we do in our 1-month challenge with our students, where it's just like, we are just going to limit our time to 1 month as kind of a trial period. So no matter how motivated you think you are, or maybe you aren't in Spanish, this trial period is going to tell you if you really can stick to the process of learning Spanish for 4 weeks, 1 or 2 hours, 5 days a week. And if you can, that kind of creates a flywheel of success.
Yes. And let's talk about that kind of environmental lifestyle, because it's very similar to what I talk about with fitness as well, like going to the gym, or kind of having to go to the gym for an hour to get your workout in versus walking throughout the day, maybe sitting on the ground, standing, like just so it's built into what they're doing already. What sort of environmental lifestyle adjustments could people make to turn this into something where maybe they don't have 2 hours to sit down and study, but they can slot it into their lives?
Yeah, I think a lot of it can begin with, the way that most students find us. The vast majority of students find us through our podcast. And so they're just listening to Learncraft Spanish while they're commuting to work. They've kind of put it into something that's already in their life. But the reason that they change like course from there and just decide, man, I really need to use the online course, I really need to upgrade to coaching, is because after slotting it in and making it a habit, and they can hear every single day like where they should be. The fact is that, as with fitness, language learning is an active process. It's not a passive thing. So many people want it to be passive. And perhaps, I'm not sure, it's obviously apples to oranges, but like you can fit in walks into your day. You can fit in cycling. I live in a city that's very car centric, and I choose not to drive a car. So I walk and cycle everywhere. I choose to be very active, and it kind of is built into my lifestyle, like you're saying. So building in, listening to a podcast is one thing, but then making it active, like speaking out loud along with the Spanish that you hear, or then taking notes on it and trying to practice those, finishing the podcast and writing out sentences in Spanish. These are all things that you can fit into your lifestyle. And with our students, we often will strategize kind of how to make that realistic. So for example, if the first thing you do in the morning is you, like I did this morning, just get up, kind of sit quietly, drink a cup of coffee, you can throw in some flashcards into that. So a little bit of active review, a little bit of like, look at the English, guess the Spanish. And there are strategic ways you can figure out how to put Spanish more actively into things that you're doing automatically. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the punchline is like, it can't be too automatic. It really has to be something that's hard and effortful for it to be good learning. But finding ways to slot that into something you're already doing means that at least you'll get a start on it without thinking about it too much.
Yeah, definitely, mate. And like, can you go through maybe some benefits that you've experienced from becoming a fluent Spanish speaker, or like why someone might maybe likes the idea, but they maybe don't understand all of the hidden benefits if they actually did the year plus and became, conversational in a foreign language? What are those benefits?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest ones is just like how many doors it opens. So more people in the world speak Spanish natively than speak English natively. And so if you speak Spanish, you're suddenly connected to so much more of the world. There are more countries that officially speak Spanish than any other language. The only language that's spoken more than English and Spanish natively is Mandarin. And I mean, honestly, like if you want to learn a second language, Spanish is much easier for English speakers than many other options out there. There's the personal fulfillment. I think for me, just like I'm the kind of person that just likes to see goals met. This is the kind of thing I do both in terms of learning any topic, because it's just a big hobby of mine is just random learning, but also in fitness too, like in hitting certain metrics like resting heart rate and things like that. It just is a personal fulfillment for me. And I think that that's a valid intrinsic motivation, actually. I don't personally have like a history of connections in Spanish before I started learning Spanish, but I did also learn the benefits of like being able to move to a Spanish speaking country and make close friends in Spanish, which I did back in 2015, shortly after first learning Spanish. I moved to Argentina and made some close friendships, really bonded with people without speaking English. And that, I can't tell you how fulfilling that feels. And then of course, there's the benefit of once you learn one language, it's a lot easier to learn another language too. And I say this as someone who's only just starting to branch out into other languages. So I can't speak too deeply on like, I can't say from experience that, I've become fluent in 5 other languages now that I've learned Spanish, but it really does make you rethink the way that you think about everything. And for me, that's very fulfilling.
Yeah, I also think like just the belief it'll give you, and that's why I love skills. Like I had a lot of blockages around like I can't do this, I can't do that. Then I learned hand balancing back in 2016, and it's like you have to do it daily or like 5 6 days a week to get good at it, because it's not like we didn't evolve on our hands. It's such a foreign way to be. And then just using those principles, started learning different activities, and now it's moved into something like Spanish, whereas before I wouldn't even think like it would even be possible. So I think that's an important thing as well for people, that if you can learn a new skill, whether it's an instrument, a language, a movement skill, like juggling is actually, I think, a great one that people could do, because it's pretty low barrier to entry to start, 2 ball, then 3 ball juggling. Very good for your brain, connections as well. But yeah, I think that's a huge one. Like just from a long-term perspective, having that belief that like you set a goal and you can actually do it in, a few months or a few years, depending on the task.
I'm curious if there's any kind of maybe patterns among your own audience that you've seen. So obviously you're in fitness, I'm in language, but there are so many skills that I see that people want to learn in addition to Spanish. And I'm actually kind of curious to hear your take on that.
You mean specific skills that I hear that people are like, oh, I'd love to be able to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I guess, well, I'm biased because I'm kind of very passionate about body weight skills and gymnastic style skills. And the reason being is the pattern I saw, like we were talking earlier about people getting results and sustaining their practice, whether it's Spanish or fitness. And if you can't do that as a coach, then your business is going to disappear very quickly. So what I found from an engagement standpoint with clients was when we moved away from the traditional, you do 5 sets and 5 reps and you do this weight and you add 2% or 5% a week, and moved it to, hey, we're working on, like, it's like a ladder of skills. So at the bottom of the ladder is like a push up off your knees. At the top of the ladder is a handstand push up. And then you could tell people, like, it wasn't just this monotonous, oh, I'm doing more weight every week, like this is so boring. It's like, whoa, this is crazy. Like I'm upside down now. Like, it's very empowering for people. And then like the pattern I've seen is clients who never trained before consistently, hated exercise, were like, when are we training next? you know
Yeah.
so that's the big thing, like the skill component, like that kind of sense of empowerment, like for people physically. So to answer your question, it's those kind of body weight skills that people are like, yeah, I'd love to be able to hand balance, love to be able to do like a muscle up on the rings where you're doing pulling yourself up and over the rings. They would be the main ones. Now there's a lot, like the community I'm in as well, a lot of people are learning to juggle as well because of that entry level. It's very accessible, and then you can use that as your first step of your skill learning ladder, because it starts building that confidence versus like you've never learned anything. Hey, let's start with Spanish. That can be like a big kind of jump if you have a lot of mindset blocks around being able to actually learn new things.
Yeah, that was super interesting just because, like, back in the day when I was in learning anything, juggling was one of the first, like, oh wow, I can pick this up. I can juggle 3 balls. Like it takes what, 10 minutes of practice every day for about a month, and then you're like, whoa, I've got this. And that's
Yes.
such a quick win. And that's the kind of it's there's something that clicks in your mind when something like that happens that it's hard to describe unless people have felt this. But when we do the 1 month challenge, for example, we're trying to replicate that by, weirdly enough, doing a grammar boot camp. It's like, we're not going to teach you how to say, where is the bathroom or how is your cat. We're just working on grammar. But since it's the top 50% of the language, you're suddenly going to be able to go online, look at a Wikipedia page of a favorite topic, switch it into Spanish, and you'll see that 50% of the words on there are like words you understand. And so the click there is just like, oh, wait a second, this is doable. Like, I've done all this already. I can do anything in Spanish.
Yeah, and we talked like 2 weeks ago, and I'm doing the new course outline, and the difference made is huge because the testing is much more frequent. So, do you want to actually? I think a nice thing to talk about now would be like you're constantly trialing stuff, you're getting feedback. So, like, how do you decide it's time to update something, and these are valid responses versus like maybe people are just frustrated and they want something different? Like, how do you decide, okay, this
Yeah.
is actually going to be a better, because it's a big ordeal, right? Going from changing the course and everything, it's a new curriculum, upskilling teachers, all this type of stuff.
Yeah, and what people say they need isn't necessarily what they need. I think it's very important to take people's feedback seriously. So if, for example, if you're training someone in some particular area and they say, man, I wish you would XYZ, from your expertise that maybe XYZ isn't really what they need, but there's something wrong either with their motivation or with the way that you're communicating it, that they don't either they don't understand the value of what they're doing, or some other version of it would be important. So what we do now, and it's so different from what we did back in the day. Now what we do is our audience is large enough that we can collect enough data to quantify a lot of things. So like in the course that you're taking, as well as in the 1-month challenge, we have a survey every other lesson. And if 40% of students fill out that survey, which fortunately we have an engaged enough audience that they do, the metrics of how difficult was this lesson compared to other lessons gives me really valuable feedback. So after 2 cohorts, we change the surveys, which lessons they're on every cohort. So after 2 cohorts, I have the numbers on every single lesson, and it's like, okay, lesson 54 looks like it was much harder than the lessons around it, according to these surveys. So that doesn't mean that we're not going to teach some of this stuff, because it's all important, but it means that we should move it around, spread it out. And I would say we update each of our courses every few months. As far as changing teaching style, so you came in from like the Accelerated Spanish podcast, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the
Yep.
new one is very, very different. And the reason is the old podcast kind of used this idea that we should teach every single word in Spanish using a mnemonic, like a memory trick and a memory palace. And what we've found over time, based on all this feedback from students who have benefited enormously from the memory palaces, is that there are some things that are more valuable to do with memory palaces and some things that just aren't. So, for example, if you're an English speaker learning Spanish, you are going to be very quickly overwhelmed by how many verb conjugations there are, or how many different pronouns there are that are just so similar to each other, the little lo, le, la, all those things. Keeping those straight in your mind is so much easier if you use a memory palace. But other parts of speech, like conjunctions or learning nouns, you don't necessarily need memory tricks for that stuff, because it's pretty easy to pick up. And so we got a lot of feedback back in the day from our students who were saying, the memory palace is too distracting. It's not what I'm wanting to learn. I want to learn the words themselves. And my pushback was like, but we see the benefits of using that for these specific areas. And so at some point about a year ago, what it told me was, what we need to do is experiment with having the memory palace there and optional for the most important things for that, keeping pronouns organized, keeping verb conjugations organized, and then just try to give it up for a little while with other parts of speech, make it just optional.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, mate. And yeah, just having that visual in your head is definitely helpful. But as you said, it's not necessary for every single part of the course, because it can be a lot of different things. With regards to your routine specifically, what's that look like these days? Like, is everything optimized, or have you gotten to the point where you're kind of letting things go if you're big into the productivity scene? How is that, maybe how is it now, and maybe how has it changed over the years?
So what I do is I change my routine about once a quarter, because I'm the kind of person who tends to be a little too all or nothing with my routines. I'll sit down and I'll be like, okay, man, I haven't met the fitness goals that I wanted to this year. So in the next 10 weeks, I'm going to do blah, blah, blah. What really helps for me personally is to set those goals, but with a limit. So only up to 2 or 3 months away. Yeah, maybe a little bit further, like my current goal. I say that and then I'm like, wait, but I just set some goals all the way to the end of the year. But what I do is each quarter, I kind of revisit, okay, what are my core values? What are the main things that are important to me? What are all the skills that I really want to be good at? And then this quarter, based on how busy I am and based on what kind of focus I have, what are realistic goals that I can set for the end of the quarter? And then how do I break that down week by week, day by day, in order to make progress? And so that applies to language, that applies to fitness, that applies to, all the other skills and knowledge that I just randomly find valuable. And so, yeah, it kind of starts with that. And then as far as daily routines go, I start the day just with like some quiet, typically no music, no podcasts, nothing. I just like sit quietly, think my thoughts, and then typically go through some flashcards. And the flashcards could be Spanish or they could be some other topic, whatever I happen to be learning at the time. Right now, I'm kind of deep into the Spanish of Buenos Aires because I'm going to Argentina again for the first time in like 8 years. I'm going back this February, so I'm very excited about that and just trying to, you know, get back into the dialect, which is so different from the rest of the world. But my morning routine like reflects the skills that I want to learn. And then for me personally, I highly value creativity and thoughtfulness. And so for me, what I've found consistently, you know, I change my goals every quarter or whatever, but consistently, the thing that I find the most valuable in a morning routine is not to have input before I have output. So if I'm going to write anything in the day, I want to write it before I've gone to social media or the news or email or Slack or anything. I need to do my writing while the ocean is like, you know, calm and glassy, because there's just going to be so many waves as soon as I check Instagram, as soon as I check Slack. That's my biggest, really consistent thing over the years.
That is such an important point. It's like night and day, you know, that kind of difference in clarity. You don't touch anything, you just go into your deep work. It's really, you know, as you said, nice and calm. You're very productive, creative. Then on other mornings, I just open Instagram and then it's just like you're like fighting through the morning, nothing gets done. So yeah, I think that's a super important point. Um, how then? So then you basically have your kind of block in the morning that you do that, and then you kind of because like how much staff are you looking after now? A lot of balls in the air, right?
Yeah, well, I read this framework. It's by Paul Graham. It's called like the maker day versus the manager day, if you can possibly swing it. So if you think about the types of things, especially the business owners have to deal with, but I think anybody who works in an office or has a remote job, there's communication stuff, there's like dealing with people, and then there's creative stuff. And so Paul Graham's idea is like there's an ideal maker day, which is you don't see or talk to or hear from anybody. And then there's the manager day where you don't get any alone time. You're just like working with people all day. And so, you know, based on where things are in the business now, I can typically organize my day into 2 or 3 maker days versus 2 or 3 manager days. So typically on Tuesday and Friday, my slots are open for calls for most of the day. And then for Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, those are the days that I really just want to be creating all day. Even on those days, I will look for messages from my team and deal with that at about midday. But the mornings on those days are my absolute best creative time.
Brilliant. And is that all like creating specifically for Learncraft Spanish, or are you thinking about doing other things as well, or is it just, you know, building that business?
For now, it's pretty much just Learncraft Spanish. There are other areas that we want to go into. Right now, it's just growing so fast. The Spanish market is bottomless, so this is where we are for now.
Yeah, yeah. It's I wasn't for whatever reason I just didn't research much. I just saw your stuff, liked it, and just jumped in. And then I was looking at other stuff, and I was like, there is so many coaching courses out there. Like it is very like the fitness industry. Like there's just so many people offering it. Um, okay, mate. So like, what what from is there any specific skills you're working on at the moment as well? You said you were going like a second foreign language, or is that specifically the dialect of Buenos Aires, or what's that second language you're working on as well?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, all of my language efforts are on Spanish and Argentinian Spanish. I've put some work into German, even started building out a memory palace for the pronouns and the verb conjugations and stuff. I really want to learn German. I'm honest with myself and have tabled it for now, but I have a very close friend who is a native German speaker and also in mnemonics and really wants to help me with this. So just, you know, for my own audience, stay tuned. It'll happen eventually. There will be a Learncraft German. I just can't give a timeline right now. And then there are other skills, of course, too. I mean, I have general fitness. When you work online and work largely from home or from an office that's like 2 blocks from home, it's so easy to forget that you have a body and exist in physical space. And so prioritizing that is important for me. I cycle a lot. I love hiking. I'm very into like drawing, starting to get into watercolor painting. Those are skills that I prioritize right now as well. And then there's just the nerdiest random like skills that I love. This is super random, but I love history and geography, and particularly like I like the idea of being able to understand the world around me and the space around me. When I go to a new city, one of the first things I want to do is learn the major avenues and how the map works, because there is that click that we were talking about earlier. There's something that happens when you study the map of a place you're going to go, and then you go there and you're like, I know this place. I can walk around and I get it. That's a huge, I can't explain it, but I just love that feeling and that sensation. And so for me right now, actually one of my current hobbies is trying to get to the point that I can draw a world map from memory using the coordinates of cities. So yeah, that probably tells you a little bit about me, just how nerdy my interests are.
Yeah, yeah. It was just remind me because it was I think it's in Accelerated Spanish. You talk about the major street in Buenos Aires. So I'm guessing
Yeah.
that's where this writing and talking about that concept came from, this interest,
Very
right?
related. Yeah, because like one of the first places I lived, the first place I lived outside my hometown was Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires, in the center of downtown Buenos Aires, there's an avenue that is the widest street in the world, the widest non-highway street in the world. And that just, learning that just helped me so much in figuring out how to get around. Everything clicked. And I was like, whoa, this feels great. I love learning maps and, again, having kind of a virtual existence and an existence in the physical world, and seeing those come together by seeing my nerdy endeavors playing out in real life just feels great to me.
Yeah, that's great, mate. What have you changed your mind on or perspective on recently? By recent, we can say the last 12 months.
The last 12 months. I mean, something big that I've changed my mind on quite a bit is the most important priorities for learning a language. So let's say, for example, there's, for this whole time that we've been doing this thing, we've had such an emphasis on memory palaces and mnemonics, because I've seen firsthand just how the light bulbs go off when people can memorize things faster using mnemonics and using memory palaces. But that has shifted in priority to not first priority for learning as far as our curriculum and stuff goes. Because what I've learned, and maybe have learned some humility along the way, is like, the research shows that one of the best ways to learn something is self-testing and just trying to predict and guess. And we still have the mnemonics and stuff, but we now are not so much the mnemonics people. I'm not the mnemonics guy so much as the testing guy. So like, when you listen to the old podcast, it's mostly stories and memory palaces. When you listen to the new podcast, the majority of the podcast is testing. It's asking you, here's an English sentence, can you predict the Spanish sentence? And so that's been a huge shift. I don't know if that fits within your 1 year time frame, but I think that's the biggest shift that's happened recently.
Yeah, totally. And like I think it's similar with everything with fitness. Like we'll keep making the comparison. Like there's best practices and there's what's the person going to be able to implement as well, because the old course, it was, it's good, but like you get lost in it a lot of the time as well, versus
Yeah.
like quizzing every 20-minute podcast, you're reviewing people. I'm guessing the feedback is that people aren't getting lost as easily.
Yeah. And people are making the connection faster. It's almost like the difference between spending from my perspective, it's like the difference between reading about skills versus like practicing them with your body. Spanish, I now believe, really is largely a physical skill, something you do with your muscles, not just in your brain. And so the practice of speaking out loud is kind of like the practice of, doing your gymnastics with your body, not just watching videos of it.
Yeah. Yeah, mate. Let's go into some rapid fire. So, given the choice of anyone in the world, who would you like to sit down with for 2, 3 hours and pick their brain and why?
Probably Adam Grant is how I feel right now. He wrote my favorite book, Think Again. I've read his other books as well. I think he has a great balance of confidence in research and in just like being objective about he's in business leadership, but he also talks about the value of rethinking and the value of not getting too cocky. And I really respect that.
Yeah, I think it's a huge one, like just staying humble regardless of how much or how good you think you're going with things. So if someone at his level is able to think that way, yeah, that's very inspiring. What are you most grateful for and why?
I'm off the top of my head, I'm super grateful for the audience that I randomly have in learning and in language. I think in the early days, I thought that I was like so good at building an audience based on how successful our podcasts were. Recently, on the launch of the new podcast, we did everything that we did back in the day and more, and didn't chart nearly as well because podcasts are so much harder to break into now. So honestly, like what I've learned is the reason we were so successful and my whole career depends on is just the accidental timing of launching a podcast when I did 9 years ago. And I'm very grateful for that. That's not something that, it's not like I was that smart. I just kind of got lucky.
Yeah, for sure. It's like I think they were saying the amount of podcasts now versus 4 or 5 years ago is, but I guess the other part of it is I think if you go past 5 or 8 episodes, the numbers are pretty crazy. Like from a lot of people launch a podcast and then they don't actually follow through with it as well.
That's true. Yeah. Well, we just recorded episode 150. So I think,
Yeah, that's
I don't know
good.
what the, yeah, I don't know what the long tail is there.
Yeah, that's great, mate. What is your greatest accomplishment to date?
The testimonials from our students in fluent Spanish, you can't beat that. It's just, I'm sure you've seen this as well with fitness. When you see your own students doing something that they thought they could never do, our students recording interviews in spontaneous Spanish is just, it's hard to beat that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, a lot of testimonials, guys. I will link all your stuff like in the show notes, but yeah, it's very cool seeing people talking just about their experience in Spanish, which is wild. Yeah. Okay, let's go into books. Let's talk about maybe one nonfiction book around productivity, learning, accelerated learning, and then maybe fiction as well.
Sure. Well, I can't recommend Think Again enough. I think it's required reading for anybody. It just is kind of refreshing. I think we live in a world of increasing division, and it almost feels like you can't find the truth anymore. And this book really, it's very refreshing. People do change their minds. There is such a thing as like realizing that you were wrong and that the truth is out there. So highly recommend Think Again. On the skill side of things, though, I really like Make It Stick, which is just kind of a compendium of research on learning. So pedagogical techniques and self-study techniques. It's by 3 researchers, and so they talk about their own research and other research that they've come across. But yeah, Make It Stick.
That's Dan and Chip Heath, is it?
I think you're thinking of Made to Stick. So a lot of people think that yeah, wait, let me see who wrote Make It Stick. Yeah, Henry Roediger, Mark McDaniel, and Peter Brown.
Okay, great. Gonna get that one. All right, last question, mate. If you could put something on a billboard in somewhere like Times Square to reach millions of people, what would you say and why?
I would quote an old Peanuts comic where Snoopy is writing a book, as he does, and he says he's writing a book about either philosophy or theology or something, and he is asked like, oh, so, I see that you're writing a book, have you come up with a title? And he's like, I have the perfect title. And so the quote is, have you ever considered that you might be wrong?
This is kind of linked to the Adam Grant book as well.
Yeah, yeah. I really think that being able to change your mind and say I was wrong is one of the most important qualities in being right.
So true, mate. And I think that's a great place to stop, mate. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing everything. Where can people learn more about you? Where are you most active? You can, whether it's the podcast, the website, just share everything and we can link it below in the show notes as well.
I recommend just hopping over to the podcast Learncraft Spanish. You'll hear a lot of my voice and a lot of testing on Spanish if you're interested in Spanish. And then if you want to connect with me, I just reach out at timothy@learncraftspanish.com, and I'd love to hear from your audience.
Great, mate. Awesome. Really appreciate you jumping on today, mate.
Thanks for having me.